In this lecture, we'll be discussing the medieval period. It's a time period from around 500 to 1500 AD. We're going to look at the different invasions that occurred during this time. We'll look at the impact of trade on cities. We'll look at the religious impacts on the landscape, some of the resultant architectural styles of the time, move away from classicism into the Gothic era, the political and economical systems of the time, such as the feudalism and the manorial system. Then we'll wrap up with looking at some examples of urban form in the Middle Ages and some of the garden design elements of the Middle Ages. This particular section 3 is going to concentrate mainly on religious positions, industries, and different events and occurrences of the medieval period. The Middle Ages was a time of constant invasion and really a very scary time for population. Around 400 AD, shortly before the Middle Ages began, the Roman Empire had divided itself into two portions: the Eastern Empire and the Western Empire. And the Eastern Empire capital was Constantinople, and you still had Rome as the Western Empire capital. But you can see that there's a tremendous amount of invasion occurring during this time, because as the Roman Empire was breaking itself apart, other people saw this disassembly and felt like they could actually help break it apart even more by invading some of the primary territories. So you see that mainly the Western Roman Empire at the time was invaded a tremendous amount more, and actually Constantinople became one of the foremost prominent military fortified cities of the time. You see the Vandals from Carthage are attacking many places on the western side of the Roman Empire. The Huns themselves are attacking from the north, and the Ostrogoths. Many people are trying to claim Rome at the time, but Constantinople is so fortified that it was tough to take over. Again, the Middle Ages was a time period from around 500 AD to 1500 AD. You may also hear medieval referred to as the Middle Ages. The terms are used interchangeably. As we just saw, the warriors that invaded the former Roman Empire had caused much instability during the early Middle Ages. And what you're going to see is that a lot of the new cities that were being designed were designed with primarily a military function and the idea of safety in mind. We also had a form of government known as feudalism, which developed, which broke the population into different subsets and classes. And servants worked the lands for really powerful lords on their manors in exchange for protection during these invasions. Also during this time, the Roman Catholic Church was very powerful. It actually began to lose a lot of its power after the Middle Ages. So during this time, it governed many aspects of the European society. And we start to see early universities develop. Economic growth had created this middle-class merchants and traders and artisans, which were in need of education. And eventually in the Renaissance and post-Renaissance, we start to see these middle-class persons, actually education start to pay off. But we see early universities during the time. Some of the other key events that happened were the Crusades were launched. The Black Death broke out in Italy. And also towards the end of the Middle Ages, you finally see Constantinople fall, which was a key event marking pretty much the end of the Roman Empire as we know it. So Europe during the 6th century, around 500 AD, was a very contested landscape, fraught with military fortifications and invasion. The early Middle Ages occurred around 500 to 1000 AD, and then around 1000 to 1250, this is called the High Middle Ages. And this was probably the pinnacle of the Middle Age society. And actually during this time, the European population doubled in size. And then by the late Middle Ages, we saw the Black Plague hit, and that actual population was cut by around 1/3, so 1250 to 1500. Started to see some bad things occur towards the end of the Middle Ages, which is what actually initially spurred the Renaissance. The feudal system was agriculturally dependent, especially for serfs and peasants. So during this time, there were new inventions for farming and much more efficient uses of land, which contributed to population growth in the High Middle Ages. So these new inventions for farming allowed for more food to be produced, which actually could support higher populations. So new tools such as the swing blades and axes and hoes all came into play during this time. And then a new plow, which was called the caruca, which was basically a horse-drawn plow. If you look on the next image on this slide, you'll see a good image of the Karuka. It actually exacerbated the amount of land which could be tilled and farmed, so it led to the growth of entire farming villages. And during this time, Europeans also started using three-field rotations because we had the animal power to save labor and actually allow more crops to be produced. You could have these larger villages, and the feudal system was acting almost like a well-oiled machine during the time, especially in the high Middle Ages. Also during this time, we saw a huge revival in trade, and in many cases, major cities would have large trade fairs to help encourage trade, and people would travel by these multiple trade routes, either by land or by sea, and actually go to these trade fairs. And those ideas caught on, and more and more cities wanted to create trade fairs for their cities. So trade began to increase. We saw a larger demand for new metals like gold and silver, especially gold and silver coins, which started to become used more and more as currency. And eventually they became a monetary system which replaced the old system of good exchange or the barter system. And so we start to see it, especially at the late medieval, new trading companies and banking firms, which would eventually lead to a commercial economic system. And banking really catches on after the medieval times are over. We get into the Renaissance, especially with the Medici family. Because of this revival of trade, cities began to grow exponentially. And most of these cities that grew rapidly were based primarily on manufacturing and trade. And like I said earlier, we have a growth in the middle class. So many merchants and artisans began to move into these revitalized cities based on whatever trade they focused on. And this collection of merchants and artisans became known as the bourgeoisie. And bourgeoisie is basically just simply a range of social classes with different trades. And so each city became known based on its bourgeoisie. What different trade collections did they have there? And most of the bourgeoisie had gained their independence from lords and had developed trades because they were moving up in the social classes. In many cases, most cities created their own governments, and the officials actually for each city were elected, not primarily based on a dictatorship. And so if you had these different collections of trades based on the populations, the different bourgeoisie would actually begin to organize themselves into different businesses. And so these businesses were known as guilds. You might hear them called craft guilds. And these craft guilds actually played leading roles in the economic lives of cities. So if your craft guilds were strong, your bourgeoisie was strong, you actually had a strong city for the most part. And most of this was dependent on your location in the existing trade routes. So you had overland connections, sea connections, but you had major cities such as Paris, Venice, Constantinople, London. All of these cities were huge trade cities at the time with large bourgeoisie populations and really strong craft guilds. So we have a revival in trade, we have a dependency on agriculture, and we also see some primary industries develop. There were three primary industries during the medieval period: woolen cloth, coal, and ironworking. So woolen cloth was really one of these industries which paralleled agricultural production because it was based on domestication of sheep and the herding of sheep. So it really overlapped the agricultural field, but it was a really big industry during the time. The creation of coal, which was either mined or actually converted from timber, was very important because houses used coal for domestic heating purposes during the time. And then coal was also used for the third principle, which was ironwork. So the idea and the ability to actually melt metal and work it into some type of tool or weapon of some sort was a really big industry. Blacksmithing. So woolen cloth, coal, and ironworking, while they were three primary or principal medieval industries, they were all somewhat dependent on one another. The medieval times has really been somewhat Hollywoodized, especially by the movie industry. So a lot of times you'll see in movies about the Middle Ages that we see knights in shining armor. Everything's very lavish. Kings and queens were adored. There was glorious pageantry, everything's really romanticized. Medieval life actually seems heroic, very entertaining, and very romantic. Now, while some of this is fairly true, the reality is that life in the Middle Ages was very harsh, very uncertain, very dangerous. So it wasn't nearly as romantic as most of the Hollywood movies will tell you. And you can see the period from 500 to 1500 here. There's a tremendous amount of invasions and conquerings and fallen empires. I mean, you can see around year 1000, the Chinese actually invented gunpowder, which would eventually shifted the idea of warfare completely. This is the time where Genghis Khan was overtaking many people. The Crusades were trying to spread the Christian religion. The Black Death, the Black Plague was moving through and killing people. We have Muhammad fleeing to Mecca, Rome being overtaken at the early Middle Ages, and we still have the kind of conquest for Jerusalem back and forth. So tremendous amount of contested landscapes during the time. The populations were actually very fearful, which is why the notion of feudalism seemed to work so well. This idea of working lands for protective purposes. One of the more militaristic events that occurred during this time was the Crusades. And from around 1096 to 1291, the church actually organized a series of military campaigns which attempted to take Jerusalem from the Turks. Now, while the Crusades failed to actually take Jerusalem, they did increase the awareness of the Europeans from the rest of the world and actually helped to accelerate economic change. So they did end up spreading the idea of the church to other places. And you can see on the map that the Christian lands during this time had grown exponentially in the purple areas. And there were 4 major crusades that attempted to take Jerusalem. The first crusade in 1096, the second crusade in 1147, the third crusade in 1189, and then the final crusade in 1202. You really see a schism to where the Christian lands are on the northern side and most of the Muslim lands are on the southern side. And so the Islamic landscapes, which we'll talk about in one of the following lectures, is actually during the same time as the medieval ages. And this was a time where these religions were trying to fight for spatial acquisition. Also, during this time, the Black Plague hit. You also hear called the Black Death. During this time, 1/3 of Europe's population decreased. And basically, the bubonic plague was carried by fleas and rats, actually beginning in Italy, destroyed most of Europe's population in the 1300s. And during this devastation and loss of population, we saw a lot of people begin to lose religious faith and start having doubts in the church, which eventually led to Renaissance ideas and more individualism-based philosophies, because the church began to lose its power in many places because there were so many people dying of the bubonic plague, the Black Death, or the Black Plague. They're all interchangeable terms. But basically, it started in Italy, and based on the overland trade routes, spread its way north, with only a few areas which were spared of the bubonic plague itself. And the spread lasted from around 1347 all the way to after 1350. So it really ravaged the European population. And if the onslaught of the Black Plague and the contentious military campaigns of the Crusades weren't enough, also during this time, England and France were warring for the control of the French throne. Now, England and France through history have had this relationship almost like a divorced couple. They still like each other, but then they hate each other, in a sense, if you want to get humorous about it. But the 100 Years' War was a series which actually was a little bit less than 100 years, but multiple conflicts waged from around 1337 to 1453 between all the different kings of England that took the throne during the time and the king of France and the different allies that would partner up with these countries to help try to overtake the French throne. Most of the major battles took place outside of France, and you can see that most of the English possessions and different allegiances and allies all abutted up against what was France at the time. And many of the battles didn't even take place within France, but ultimately France would keep much of its territory. But because many of the cities were under attack by England, they had to be heavily fortified in case they were needed during these times of conflicts. Even though the church lost some of its power towards the end of the Middle Ages, the church in the High Middle Ages especially played a really vital role in the lives of Europeans. And the church itself became one of the more social areas within the city and had some certain political powers. Churches were places of worship. They were places of socialization, as the squares around many of the churches. They were sites which were very important to Europe, especially European Christians. And they also became sites of pilgrimage from other cities. So the overland trade routes were used as pilgrimage purposes as well. And you're going to see that the church actually was able to control some of the land in the feudal system. They could actually regulate taxes. But by the end of the medieval period, you saw kind of a weakening of the church based on many of the things we just talked about, especially the Black Plague. And the church itself begins to break apart into different denominations. The church itself controlled about 1/3 of the land in Western Europe at its peak. So it owned a lot of the land and could allow basically feudal lords in the manorial system to actually regulate these areas for agricultural purposes. In many cases, you'll see in some of the cities that the church itself doubled as a citadel, so people would, if their cities were being overtaken, would relocate to the church for defense purposes. And the church itself during this time tried to actually curb some of the warfare, and they put forth the notion that only 40 days a year were allowed for combat, which generally was almost laughed at, especially since the church itself was organizing crusades, military campaigns to actually spread its knowledge and its thoughts and its philosophies. They inserted the tithe tax, the 1/10 tax on the assets. If you were peasant or the bottom of the feudal system layout, you were assessed only a 1 penny tax. If you look at the chart here, I found this interesting chart of a typical monk schedule during the Middle Ages. And you can see the day was filled with multiple functions, right? Not really a long sleeping schedule. You had numerous amounts of church services that the monks would conduct. In the middle of these, they were meditating and reading up on the church knowledge and scripture. Small periods where they would actually eat, especially during the winter, they would only eat once a day. And then these were actually interrupted during periods of work, and so they would actually do labor services other than typical church-related occupations. And so one of the last great pieces to the spur of the Renaissance, really, and the lapse in the faith in the Catholic Church was the Great Schism. And in 1054, the church split into the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. You see the blue area on the right side, or the eastern side, was the Orthodox Church, and the western side of Europe was basically the Catholic Church, what was left of the Holy Roman Empire and its surrounding countries. The Western Church had multiple popes simultaneously from 1378 to 1417, and basically this allowed for the influx of much more new denominations which would come out of this splitting apart. So people said, hey, the church split in its belief set, maybe there's room for new denominations, and this basically weakened the power of the church and the faith in the church. So the authority of the church in civil affairs began to break apart, and you add in the Black Plague and the multitude of invasions during the time. People were terrified to be alive, and one of two things happened. You would either draw closer to the church, or you would begin to doubt its power. In this section, we'll differentiate the architectural styles of the medieval era. Specifically, we'll try to compare and contrast Gothic architecture versus Romanesque architecture. The Gothic era began around 1150, so we're looking at somewhat about the middle of the Middle Ages. In regards to the architecture, the Romanesque arch basically got a point. And if you look at the next image on this slide, you see the pointed arches and how the difference between a lot of the Romanesque arches and the Gothic arches. So basically, if you see a tipped arch, it's characteristic of a Gothic style. Buttresses, or the supporting pillars for walls, began to fly. That means they were detached. So we saw a lot of detached support columns. We saw much more use of glass and larger windows, and actually this glass was stained. And there was a more of an emphasis on a vertical layout. We saw really elongated stretched spires, which were somewhat mimicking of the pointed arch, elongated tipped spires on a lot of these cathedrals and the different architectural elements of the Gothic era. Art itself was based primarily on realistic pictorial space, less based on human figures. Now when we get into the Renaissance, it moves towards almost purely humanist based. Music itself, we see the initialization of polyphony, which is rhythmic notation in the sense that there were multiple instruments being used together using the same rhythm. And basically the idea in the medieval style that life is really not such a good thing. Humans are not good people, but God is great and can help you through the kind of turmoil that life brings. The Romanesque style of design was roughly from around 1000 to 1137 AD. It was also dubbed as the period of the church triumphant. The Romanesque style was built into many cathedrals. And characteristic of this style of architecture is the rounded arches, or the Roman arch itself. The tops of the interior walls were typically barreled. In other words, they were round and almost arched themselves. Walls were very, very thick during this time to support really heavy architecture. Insides were less window lit and very dark and simple. And the windows themselves were very small, and they were placed generally at the top of the wall. and we see a totally different style when the Gothic era began. Now, this course is mainly concerned with the landscape itself and the design characteristics of the landscape, but it's important to know the difference between Romanesque and Gothic architecture, as these terms will also be utilized throughout the remainder of the course. So the differences between Gothic and Romanesque cathedrals were, one, the pointed arches implemented on Gothic cathedrals rather than the basic half-circular arches for the Romanesque cathedrals. The flying buttresses, basically the freestanding wall supports instead of wall supports abutting the walls they were supporting. We see them detached. The large stained glass windows instead of the small basic windows. The interiors were much more ornate and elaborate and airy because of the tall spires. Because of the windows and the open air interiors, there was much more light inside of these cathedrals. And the sculpture became more lavish, really became larger than life. They began to implement a lot of time and money into creating really amazing sculptures. And here's a typical Gothic cathedral with its major dome area in the midpoint, fairly symmetrical layout, and typical interior functions of chapels, aisle areas, choir areas, and spaces for meditation and preaching. In this section, we'll cover feudalism, look at how it impacted town life in the Middle Ages, and compare it to the economic system of a manorial system and how that interacted with the governmental system of feudalism. One of the major features of medieval towns and the feudalistic government was the early timber-framed house. And you see here that many of the timber-framed houses during this time actually employed the Gothic arch inside them. So really a basic rectangular layout with these point-tipped arches, which serve as basically the structural envelope for exterior walls, which were created from overlapping of thatches and straws and things of that nature. But the feudalistic governmental system basically dotted the landscape with many of these early timber framed houses because peasants would live in these simple architectural ensembles and farm the land surrounding them for the lords that governed the manor in the manorial system. So town life was almost as simple as some of the architecture. Villagers themselves, other than living in their really simple early timber framed houses, typically would wear simple tunics, and they would dye them in bright colors using different vegetable dyes that they had created. Now, interestingly enough, during this time, the button had not yet been invented. So if you're ever watching a documentary about medieval towns and you see someone with a button, that's actually historically inaccurate. The typical life of a person during this time was around 40 years old. So remember, this is a really contested time when it comes to invasions. So there was a lot of stress and a lot of murderous intent. So people will live very short lives. And just as a humorous effect, toilet paper had not been invented yet either. So they were very sustainable in the fact that they used moss and small-scale lichen-type plants as cleansing devices for when they used the bathroom. The manorial system was the economic system of the time. Basically, a set of different manors which were ruled by lords, and serfs would work the lands of the lords. So a manor itself is an agricultural estate ran by a lord and worked by the serfs or the peasants. So there was a system of different manors, and each manor had a lord associated with it, and these lords would govern the serfs. The serfs provided labor services. They would pay rent to the lords and were subject basically to the control of the lord for their own protection. Peasant women had to work in the field. They had to raise children. They had to manage the household. And obviously the peasant men had to basically do most of the hard labor in the fields. You see the setup here where the manor house has a giant orchard beside it. Typical agricultural fields beside the riverway. There's certain fields that are set aside specifically to be cultivated for the Lord and not sold to others. The village around the manor is where most of the serfs lived. Always a church and a place for the priest to live. Common areas to socialize within. And so each manor serves as its own small-scale village. And then a series of these manors constituted an entire city layout. The life of a serf or peasant was a tough one. And basically, the manorial work cycle was dependent upon the seasons. Seasons of the year dictated the peasants' activities. You can see that each month, despite what the seasons were, there was always a job to do. whether it be seeding or reaping, repairing fence lines, or harvesting, or even scaring birds away. The life of a peasant was tough and always taxing. The chart here shows an interesting month-by-month layout of the duties of a peasant based on the different seasons. So the peasants would do everything. They would plant, they would harvest, they would separate, they would organize, they would plow, they would shear, they would weed, they would scare the birds, they would butcher, they would work the animals, and they would do upkeep and blacksmithing. Let's discuss what the feudal system is a minute. It's basically the basis of the local government in Europe from around the 12th to the 13th centuries, and a system that really restructured society around relationships derived from the holding of land by the lords in exchange for service or labor provided by the peasants. So you see the four-tiered social class here, where the serfs and the peasants were offered protection by the lords, and they worked the land. The lords gave them food and shelter and protection. The protection was provided by the knights, which were the vassals to the lords, and the lords also gave the knights food and shelter and protection from the king. And they were basically the direct connection to the king himself, who had the ultimate say. But the fact that the feudal system was operationalized and the manorial system set up a series of agricultural villages created really a rural food surplus, because they had so much abundance of work and labor to work the land, and all the new agricultural innovations and technologies that were sprouting up. So the system was effective when it came to actually creating food for cities. Manorialism was the economic system, and feudalism was the government system. And manorialism said that agriculture was the basis for wealth. They divided lands up into small-scale, self-sufficient manors based on this agriculture. And for the most part, in these different manners, trade and barter were the usual form of exchange. And again, peasants or serfs, they worked the land, paid rent in exchange for protection. Feudalism, on the other hand, was actually the governmental system which regulated the manorial system. And it was basically a four-tiered system of social classes, which was dependent upon the relationship between members of nobility in the exchange of persons below them. The lords and his vassals administered justice, and they were the highest authority in their lands, obviously under the king. So that's the difference in feudalism and manorialism.
In this section, we'll look at some medieval urban form typologies, discuss the primary elements in medieval cities, discuss some of the categories of medieval cities, and then show you some examples of those types of cities that occurred during the Middle Ages. As we discussed, settlement in Europe was very sporadic before the Roman Empire. Most of the settlements clustered up near Mesopotamia, now River Valley, and in this River Valley areas. The Roman Empire was a big settlement phase in European history. Now, urban life really disappeared almost after the fall of the empire. And then you had a couple of centuries where a very slow process of down development until around the 13th century. More or less the middle of the medieval era, we start to see cities start to develop again. And these cities developed in a manner which was consistent with the feudal system and the manorial setup, and also highly militarized and fortified. Medieval castles are a great microcosm of the city layout itself. You can look at this diagram of the castle here and see many of the elements that are actually found in medieval towns themselves. They're heavily fortified. The barbican, which is basically a tower above the opening drawbridge. The curtain wall area for defense purposes. Typically you would see a moat around the castle. We see moats around the cities themselves, so this waterway around the edge. And there's churches and areas for obtaining water, storing grain. So in many cases the castles were where people would retreat to because they provided a second line of defense from the city. And so castles were the main focal points of most medieval towns, and in many cases they were actually detached somewhat from the town, at least either through a wall or some form of topographical change. The castle and the cathedral were the two major architectural elements in medieval towns. But we also saw four similarities in urban development within medieval cities. Obviously, feudalism as the form of government was one of the key similarities, but the revival in commerce created a need for open public spaces and streetscapes within the city. The role that the church played was very prominent, and many times commerce and social functions would take place in areas abutting directly outside of the church. And then just industrial processes. So space was needed to industrialize these cities with the major industries of the time of wool, coal, and iron melting. And so all of these industries played a role in the layout of the city. Now, obviously, military fortifications also played a major role, but they were adjusted per city. Typically, we would see a major wall, a moat around the edge, and on the wall there would be a series of defense towers as well. The town hall, there was usually a main square, and in many cases there was another wall behind the major outer wall, and that wall typically would surround the cathedral and castle areas. Medieval design was a movement towards less of a classical approach and more towards a Gothic approach. The decline in classicism was lost with the fall of the Roman Empire. And because this was about reviving trade and an economic system based on a feudal government, city functions or civic functions became the cornerstone of the design of these cities. The city itself was a complete entity because it was walled in, and these basically parceled out according to the functions that each space would necessitate. And being that we were in a feudal system with different classes and a social hierarchy, citizens basically became ranked hierarchically within these walled-in villages and cities. And one thing that differentiated these cities from classical cities is that there's a unity between the scale of the buildings and the neighborhood. So typically the castle and the church and the town hall would be the major buildings, so the larger buildings. So typically the landmarks were these standout iconic structures, and then in the residential areas were the thatch huts and housing for the layperson within the feudal system were based much more on a human scale.
Let's recap some of the major elements of medieval urban form. The first thing, obviously, is the wall itself, which surrounds and protects the city. The second are the towers and gates. So most of the major entrances on this wall had a gate associated with it. Around these walls, you see these grand cylindrical towers for the most part. In many cases, major town buildings were massed together. So the church, the town hall, the castle, they would typically be in the same general vicinity. The church itself was always a major iconic piece, and the marketplace, which was typically an open area to exacerbate trade. We start to see private garden spaces, especially in some of the lords' houses in the manorial system, and then just overall streets and circulation. So once you get into town, these major buildings and houses and manors all needed to be connected. So we start to see early connectivity amongst functional spaces within the city.
Walls were the most iconic feature of medieval cities. They were the distinctive piece in English and European town defenses until around the 14th century, when cities began to expand and walls were having to be knocked down for this expansion. It was the enclosure of the city, and it held the social fabric together, and also the major fortification piece. Now, these walls were so heavily fortified and so monolithic in a sense that they actually were the primary determinant of the urban form of these cities, because the city had to form within these walls and moats that surrounded them. And on the flip side, it actually limited horizontal growth. And so the growth that the city needed to take on to expand had to actually occur in phases or in stages, because they had to break a piece of the wall down, build the city up, and then rebuild the wall around that area. So while it was a great piece for fortification purposes, it was also both a determinant of urban form, but also a deterrent of future urbanization.
The street system was also very important to middle-aged city layout. Major streets typically radiated from entry gates, and primary thoroughfares, the major arterials, were actually just linear extensions of the market, and they tried to connect a lot of the irregular spaces in these cities to a lot of the major structures. Now, wheeled traffic during this time, as far as chariots and other means of traveling similar to this nature, diminished significantly during this time. It was a more pedestrian-based society within the walls of these cities. So street frontage became a strong commercial asset, especially near the gates and market areas, and then actually you would have a lot of commercial operations taking place on the streets. So away from these major streets, which connected major landmark areas, market areas, gate areas, became a small-scale system of internal streets for local travelers, people that live within the city that would sell their goods and services on these internal streets, local streets. But on these major streets, buildings tried to encroach as far as they could into the street system, and the street became a really, really heavily intense scene of commercial activity. The population per acre was totally different throughout the entire medieval city. In most of the trading areas and the trading centers in these cities, you saw heavily dense pockets of urbanization, especially near church areas and market areas. These areas were really crowded. But this density was not uniform throughout the entire city. So on these less dense areas, there was room for gardens and orchards, which were turned into these spaces from residents. Now, when we get into the Renaissance, these cities swelled up basically, and overcrowding began. Because of the fortification methods of the wall, the city was somewhat inflexible and couldn't expand very rapidly. And during that time, you start to see it became difficult to dispose of refuse and actually provide water to the entire city. So as these cities filled up, these major problems continued to exacerbate themselves.
Because of the major revival in trade, the marketplace was extremely important position in the medieval town. As discussed earlier, the street actually became an expansion of the market. And the market locations within these cities really varied. Siting was dependent upon the city, but this was an area where major street connections were and large areas of density occurred. In many cases, you would see an irregular building, which was somewhat of a landmark in the city, which was located at a central position in the city, would act as the kind of catalyst for placing the marketplace around. But for the most part, when these cities were laid out, most of the needs of the surrounding spaces came first, and then whatever space was left over, that would be where the market was forced into. And so we saw two different types of markets in the medieval town. We saw where markets occupy the square in the center of the city, and then in other cases, there were spaces where the market was locating at the widening of the end of a main street. In other words, a street that came out of the most prominently used gateway. Typically, at the end of that street, there would be a widening, and that street would just be the expansion of the market. So two different types of markets. One of the other major spaces in the city was the square abutting the church. This area is known as the parvis. The parvis is a space around the church where people gathered before or after service, and sometimes it would act as a burial ground as well. In many cases, there would be a church and a market square, and the parvis would adjoin these two spaces, which created this kind of two-dimensional nucleus. The church square was the parvis, and the parvis was in competition with the market square as the most popular public space in the medieval city. Overall, there are two different categories of medieval towns. They can be organic growth towns or planned new towns. Organic growth towns are simply towns that grow chaotically with no reinforced structure guiding their growth. And then planned new towns are towns that are laid out in accordance with some type of regulatory system. Now, under these categories, there's three different tiers of organic growth towns and two different tiers of planned new towns. The first type of organic growth town is the towns of Roman origin. And these are the towns that basically remain through which referred to as the Dark Ages here. That's another term for the Middle Ages or the medieval era. It was referred to as the Dark Ages by people of the Renaissance. These are towns that the Roman Empire set up, and these towns were either revitalized or reestablished on their original sites. The second type of organic growth town is a burg. Burgs were founded as fortified military towns originally, and then actually reestablished themselves as commercial cities later on. So originally burgs were founded as these military-based towns for fortification purposes only, but due to the revival in trade, they eventually became more commercially functioning. The third type of organic growth town is a village settlement. And these were just really small towns which occurred due to the expansion in population increasing, the expansion of cities and the increase in populations in smaller villages. In many cases, you would see small villages grow together to form one town. The second category is a planned new town. And there were two types of planned new towns. There were bastide towns and planted towns. Now, bastide towns were really tremendously fortified towns, typically found in France, England, and Wales, and they were built in an effort to colonize unexplored areas or wilderness areas in Europe. And then you saw on the other side planted towns. So if you weren't a town of a Roman origin or a burg or a village settlement or a bastide town, everything else is known as a planted town, as long as it's planned. And so these planted towns were the towns founded throughout the rest of Europe. And we're going to go through examples of each one of these categories and tier of towns in the next few slides.
Many of the towns of Roman origin were destroyed by invasion during the lapse of the Roman Empire. In many cases, the Roman gridiron and the cardo decumanus structure was lost, especially in these medieval towns. Most of the new growth on these old Roman towns was generally unplanned. Selective portions of earlier Roman civilizations were actually kept in many cases, but some towns actually disappeared altogether. But the ones that remained in these towns of Roman origin, where these medieval cities were produced upon them, really adjusted their layout for the most part very tremendously. So the reason why these towns were actually rebuilt or revitalized because they had an advantageous location. And so while the siting of the city was advantageous for military purposes, the existence of the urban patterns really never get reinstated other than selected pieces that they kept as almost like museumized relics. Burgs were towns that started as military cities and became more commercially based. And they primarily occurred in Western Europe. Now, while they were originally built as defense mechanism from invasion and served as military centers early on, they were actually commercialized when they were redeveloped in the Middle Ages. In most cases, the church became the more defensive area in the city once it was commercialized, and it became more of a religious-based citadel. And what happened was these small-scale burgs, or sometimes referred to as boroughs, these really small urban cities, had trading centers which would sprout out outside their walls that eventually would make their way in. So if you look at the map of Edinburgh here, you see the medieval town itself, and we see a linear village on the entranceway on the western side, and a couple of small-scale villages on the northeastern side of the town. Basically just commercialized villages that these realms of commerce make their way into the city, and it becomes less fortified and more about money. There were also smaller-scale village settlements, which were not as big as burgs or towns of Roman origin or other planned towns, were really relatively small, very dispersed, and had irregular forms. Now, typically these village settlements would become towns when they developed some type of local trading industries. The three types of different villages. There were enclosed villages, which had really small scale walls, very, very lightly fortified. If you look on the next image on this slide, you'll see an interesting medieval village. They also had linear villages, which most of the time were built along streets or roadsides that had high trade occupancies along them. And then disintegrated villages, which were typically scattered and isolated from other areas. Normally these would be in wilderness or unexplored areas. But in some cases you would have a series of disintegrated villages in close proximity to one another that would grow together to form actually a large town itself. Towns of Roman origin, burgs, and village settlements were organic growth type towns. And there was a number of aspects that contributed to organic layout of these towns. One was the economic structure. What was the typical crafts and trades and popular market items of the city? What was the social structure made up of? Was it typical craftsmen? Was it mostly merchants? How did the aristocracy run their manors? What about the physical structure of the city itself? Was it, if it was heavily fortified, then it was probably going to remain longer. What type of town was it, and how did the public buildings function, and where were they located? The legal personality was also important. Each city basically could govern itself, so the Constitution and the bylaws built into that city were very important. It could help to allocate where districts would form. Obviously, the connection to water and physical situation of the land itself, if it was tucked into steep topography, would also affect how big the city was. And then just the political vitality. So kings were elected through bloodlines for the most part. So their ability to retain successful leadership in these towns also was important to whether it growed or not. One of the key components to organically growing a town was to develop an armature for this growth. And an armature is something that spurs growth around it. And one of the key elements that the Middle Ages developed as an armature for growth was the idea of universities. So Oxford, England was founded in 912 by the Anglo-Saxon, which actually stood for Oxen Ford. If you look at the second image, you'll see why it's called that. A ford is basically a river crossing. But the city itself was located within this natural moat provided by the river surrounding it. And the King Edward basically implemented this broken grid street pattern within Oxford, England. It was invaded by the Danish in year 1009, and they burned it to the ground, and it was rebuilt as a medieval town. One of the earliest universities was established in Oxford, and that was basically spurred the growth of the town itself. And you're going to see in the next slide that that trend caught on in the medieval period. So So this is a great map showing all the medieval universities which sprouted up during the Middle Ages. The period was really characterized by university towns, although the fact that it was referred to as the Dark Ages because of their uneducated manner is somewhat ironic, because there were so many university towns sprouting up, including the ones we just spoke of, Oxford, also Cambridge, and many major towns actually throughout all of Europe.
So Bastide towns were heavily fortified towns, primarily found in French, English, and Welsh areas. Typically this land was granted from the king to create military fortification cities. It had three primary principles for Bastides. One, they were typically new urban foundations founded upon pre-existing plan forms. So they would create these new cities based on pre-existing plans. That's typically the gridiron system, which formed the basis of their layout. In other words, they would have a gridded street for the most part, and then typically a central square in the center of the city, which was primarily where many of the military functions took place. And if you live there, actually, your house came with farming area outside of the house, so there was land tied to your house, and it came with certain economic privileges. Now, these economic privileges, today you wouldn't think of as privileges, but back then it was considered prideful to take care of the church and the town hall and upkeep these things, and that was some of the prestige that came with owning a house in these Bastides. So they were almost aristocratic type military fortification towns. Most of the French Bastides wanted to be, for the most part, self-sufficient, and they wanted to basically be the major sources of agricultural production and trade centers of the time. So they were very dense and very organized and very well laid out in an effort to increase their agricultural production and trade production. And you can see at the diagram at the top right, it was basically a series of equal-sized housing plots, so everyone that lived there had the same size of housing. The central city was typically a square for military purposes, organized around a gridiron layout. Typical of most medieval cities, encompassed by a wall and surrounded by a moat or ditch. The tenants themselves were responsible for the upkeep of the town hall, the church, and their own homesteads. So that was some of their economic prowess given. And during times of invasion, the church would function as an emergency military citadel. You can see the example of Montflanc in France. The gridiron layout, the central square, the four major arterial streets, a really dense housing area. And if you look at the top right diagram, you see the equal-sized housing plots.
Aigues-Mortes is a good example of a French Bastide. It was established in 1240 by King Louis IX. And it was a base for some of the Crusades to Israel, actually. So built specifically for the Crusades themselves. In 1272, the wall was built around the city, and actually the wall still exists in its original form. So Aigues-Mortes is a functioning city contemporarily. It's been obviously adaptively reused into the city you see now, but the image you see in the background is actually a picture of the city contemporarily. If you look at the next image on this slide, you see a great diagram of what the city looked like when it was originally built. And the town square itself is not exactly in the center of the city. It's about 1/3 across the western side of the city with the public buildings clustered around it. There's the town hall, the church. The street system is more of a distorted grid. We see east and west, two major arterial streets, and north and south we see two on the southern side and one that collides with the square on the north side. If you look on the diagram here on the second image on this slide, top of the image there's the letter A beside this black dot. That's actually the Tour de Constance, which is their most famous citadel. Now is a lighthouse beacon. And actually the reason why there was a lighthouse there was there used to be a channel linking this city to the Mediterranean Sea, which this connection's really been lost now because the channel has silted up. You see many of the characteristics we talked about in Bastides towns and Aigues-Mortes' layout. The central square, the really dense housing, the clustering of public buildings around the square, the wall and the towers around the wall, and then the moat itself. English Bastides were probably the weakest of all three Bastide types, French, Welsh, or English. There were really only two English Bastides towns, Winchelsea and Kingston, and they were replacement harbors for sea towns that had basically been overtaken at one point. And so they replaced these with new towns from towns that got destroyed. And both of these places basically had really weak walls and eventually fell victim to the retreat of the sea line. We'll talk to you about Winchelsea as an example, and you'll see how weak these things were compared to French Bastides and Welsh Bastides. But we do see similar layout characteristics. So here's an example of an English Bastide town, the town of Winchelsea, England. If you look at the images here, we see on the left is the layout of Winchelsea in medieval times, and on the right is what it looks like contemporarily. So the town has basically died out. If you look at the second image on this slide, you'll see one of the reasons why it died out, at least in the medieval times, because the defense walls were very, very weak. They were made of wood, much weaker than most of the medieval walls that we're used to. So this defense station against French coastal invasions failed fairly miserably. Now, you see really similar layouts of other Bastide towns, the gridiron layout. If you look on the left image of the medieval plan of Winchelsea, basically, if you look on the third set of blocks from the north, we see a small shape in the middle of a block. That's where the church was. So an interesting difference in Winchelsea is that the church is actually separated from the market square. So you move from the church 3 blocks down, that's actually where the market square is. So 3 blocks directly north of the church. So here we see a separation of church and central square, which is not typical of most Bastide towns. But you see many of the other similar characteristics with the Bastide characteristics we spoke of. The main difference being the separation of the church from the square, and obviously the very, very weak defense walls.
Welsh Bastides, on the other hand, were probably the most fortified, and particularly the ones built by Edward I. He built 10 Bastides in Wales, and basically all his Bastides were built purely for military purposes, economic motives, and he did them in an attempt to actually teach civility to the Welsh population. So he thought that these Bastides could place the civil population near the uncivil population, and these uncivilized persons could be taught by living amongst civility. All 10 of these Bastides are concentrated along the coastlines, placed at really key river crossings and navigable inlets. Many of these Welsh Bastides would actually become castle towns because the Bastides themselves would serve as castles, and then towns would actually develop around these. So if you look at the next image on this slide, you see a good plan of Caernarfon Castle, which is one of Edward I's Bastides, which is actually what the photo is of the first image on this slide. You can see the really massive walls on this Bastide. But if you look at the plan view, we see really huge towers. Each tower had a function, whether it be a well, a prison, a place for storing grains, watchtower. Each one of the towers had a specific function. The inner ward was where the civilized persons would reside, the aristocracy, and the outer ward was everyone else in the city or in the Bastide town. We just saw an image of the massive town wall, and in the plan view here we see how large the moat was around this Bastide as well. So it was really difficult to get into. So of all 3 of the Bastides we cover, the Welsh Bastides are actually probably the most fortified. And they're a bit different in that they're less organized around the street system and more organized around the ability to develop spaces for the aristocracy separated from spaces from the non-aristocratic. So Flint, England is actually an example of a Welsh Bastide. Obviously it was overtaken by the English, but it was actually developed as an early Welsh Bastide. And it was the first of King Edward I's Bastide towns. Now here they planned the castle area, which is the image you see, and the town separately. In King Edward's Bastides, we always saw a delineation between castle and the townspeople, either through a wall or through separation by topography. In this case, we have a wall around the castle, and then the town is actually separated through both instances. The castle is placed on a higher point in the city, and then the wall around the castle, a small road that connects the townspeople to actually this castle here. The castle and the town were planned separately. They were later integrated through this roadway. The roadway was a main street that connected it. The gridiron layout was basically for the townspeople, not the castle itself. And so how did Flint get taken over? Well, the Flint diminished its military function by around 1650. And it was nearly desolate. Everyone had left, and then didn't really revitalize itself till around the mid-1800s. That's when it actually began to function again as a town. So contemporarily, we see the ruins of the old castle area here now. Where the townspersons resided is actually a revitalized community contemporarily.
So planted towns were every other kind of town that were planned. Total of around 120 medieval planted towns, and they were located primarily at viable locations along either collisions of roadways and intersections or intersections of rivers or fords and rivers. For the most part, these towns were laid out at a point of tangency on the road or waterway, because these were the viable locations, these intersections. And we saw roadways serving as basically the property boundaries of many of these planted towns between the different settlements. So if you had two adjoining parishes, a roadway which split them in two, that was typically utilized as the property boundary. So we saw a lot of meads and bounds used as boundary area. So, my city goes up to this river, or my city extends to this roadway, or to this mountain, or to these set of trees. That is the way these planted towns were initially planned according to. Because riverways were so important for planted towns, we saw the Dutch in the water-stained landscape of the Netherlands and the Holland area housing many of these planted towns. So an example would be Amsterdam. So the Dutch really revered settlements near water. If you look at them nowadays, there's billions and billions of dollars put into infrastructure to allow for development in these areas that's not susceptible to flooding. So in many cases, these planted towns, the land had to be drained before they could even settle here in the Netherlands, because it's a very marshy aquatic area. So the Netherlands would plan these really large villages in these drained areas, and then they try to extend these large areas into new towns. And really, villages on higher ground were the only places in the Netherlands that were not planned, because there was so much planning that had to go into these lowland areas that were so marshy. And one of the key things in the Netherlands was this idea of the burger house. And if you look at the next image on this slide, you see the two types of burger houses. And burger houses were residential units for the middle class. If you think about the human scale we talked about for the layout of many of these medieval towns, the burger house really shows this idea of feudalism in the landscape pretty well, because we see the humble abode for the poor people, and then the richer people had these much nicer burger houses. And this was a really strong component of planted towns in the Netherlands. Other non-aquatic based planted towns, such as Salisbury, England, took a different approach. So there's so many different types of planted towns that it's interesting to study their different layouts. So Salisbury was originally settled in 100 AD. At that time, it was known as Old Sarum, but it got abandoned for around 500 years. So 500 years later, William the Conqueror built a castle there and then rebuilt the outer fortifications around this castle. There was a nearby town of Wilton that actually got invaded by Vikings in 1092, and then they actually built a cathedral there. And so the town was still there, and then the cathedral was built, and then basically the castle itself and the cathedral and leftover town became one giant city, which was known as Salisbury. While the castle was placed on a hilltop, once the town encompassed it, basically the focus was shifted from that hilltop to the river itself, because the town was dependent upon it. We see this circular wall around it, the moat again. If you look at the next image on this slide, we see an interesting layout of the remnants of Salisbury. A is where the castle itself and the market square resided. The town hall is B, where it was located. And then C is where the church was located. And so we see kind of outlines of where these things were once located. And so the church is located down near the rest of the village itself, away from the castle, as well as the town hall. And then the market square was located in the castle area. In this section, we'll get into a little bit more finer grained for the medieval city components, especially in regards to the squares within the cities themselves, the towers, and the piazzas. And we'll go through several examples of each of these. Public squares were both a medieval and a Renaissance cornerstone. They began in the medieval era and then went to the next level in the Renaissance. In Italy, these are referred to as piazzas, and piazzas are just basically public squares, plazas, or open marketplace areas. We're going to talk through a series of these piazzas and medieval square examples to show you kind of the importance of these squares and how they were laid out, the typical buildings that surrounded them, and the typical functions that occurred within them. The first square we can talk about is the Piazza della Signoria in Florence, Italy. Now, Florence itself is a major urban center with a series of smaller sub-centers which feed off of that major urban center. And the Piazza della Signoria is the major public square within that urban center of Florence. Originally, in the medieval times, Florence was conceived as this self-contained urban center, and the Piazza della Signoria was its major open market area. And the major streets within the town layout acted as a linkage between major government buildings and the square itself, and it connected it to the river Arno. So the street actually cuts through the palace area so that the cathedral around the square is connected to the rest of the city. If you look on the next image on this slide, there's a couple of different images. One is an aerial view, and if you hover over it, you can see the plan view of the Piazza della Signoria. And the plan view shows this connection to the riverway from the square itself. The long stretch through the palace area here is number 5, and it connects to the river. The number 1 here is actually a fountain, which is symbolic of the connection to water. So we have a major fountain in the middle of the square, which is typical of medieval squares. And then number 3 here is actually the cathedral itself. In many cases in the medieval era, you're going to see the cathedrals and the churches abutting the major square piazza areas, and these piazzas basically served as the parvis and the open kind of market area around them. Todi, Italy has somewhat of a different layout than Florence's square. It's much more elongated and is set up on a series of vistas. So the vista towards the cathedral, the vista towards the countryside, the vista towards the town hall. So these vistas create this interlocking square. The center of the square is architecturally contained by surrounding commercial residential functions, and then obviously the cathedral and town hall. Also, there are openings towards the countryside. So if you look on the plan view of the map, there's these green areas are the countryside outside of the dense city. So we see a great views from the square to the countryside. It provides a scenic background, and it shows this separation between town and country. The cathedral, again, is the most iconic piece of architecture. It's on the north side of the piazza, and then on the south side we see the major connection to the countryside and the town hall. The square in Perugia, Italy is even more elongated than the one in Todi, and basically it has the church area and the parvis around the cathedral connected through a promenade which links it to the square itself. And a promenade is just a level area intended specifically for walking, which connects two major squares, the parvis and the market square itself. And the major water feature is in the central square to basically enhance the square, make it its own aesthetic piece. And you see a photo of the major fountain area on this slide. The squares themselves are anchored by the town hall again and the cathedral. Cathedral's on the south side, the town hall's on the north side. And that promenade is basically the main street of Perugia. Very significant walkable street in the middle of the city which connects the two major public spaces. Venice, Italy has a series of public squares within it as well. But probably the major piazza is the Piazza San Marco. Now Venice, the city itself existed, really was just a big marsh until around the 11th century. If you know anything about Venice, basically the entire city's built on a set of canals and waterways. So the seawalls really support the city, and this clearly delineated canal system reflects the city through the reflection on the water. The canals mirror the city's image, but also act as the major circulation piece throughout the city. And so if you go there, you'll have to travel by gondola, when a gondola is the major means of transportation. Basically, nowadays, a motorized water taxi. But we're going to talk about the Piazza San Marco in Venice. So this is a map of medieval Venice, and you can see how the water clearly acts as the circulation system throughout the city in this once marshy area. Where the star is located on this map is where the Piazza San Marco is located within the city. If you look on the next image on the slide with the V button, you see another star, and you can see where it's located contemporarily. Right off the edge of the river, the major river that rips through the heart of the city. And so it was very important for early medieval market and trade areas because it was right on the aquatic trade route that connected Venice to the rest of the world.
Originally, the Piazza San Marco was simply an extension of the Grand Canal which ran through the city, which is basically what the river is that stretches through the heart of the city. But eventually it became a formal space which functions as the parvis for the Cathedral of St. Mark. And if you look at the next image on this slide, you'll see where St. Mark's is in relation to the square itself. So again, we see the piazza serving as a public space abutting the major cathedral in the city, and it's connected to the riverway. Originally, it was just this small forecourt for the parvis area of St. Mark's, but it was eventually extended to the west somewhat more to make a larger open piazza space. So where that line is on the plan view, that dashed line was the original area, and then it got extended further west as it became more popular. So it was just a small, irregularly shaped rectangle and became more oblong and more of an L-shaped space after the extension. The major bell tower is the pivot point of this L shape. So in the first image here, you see a good shot of the bell tower on the right center of the image, and then if you look on the plan view, you see the bell tower right on the cusp of where the L breaks in the space. It's under the label Campanile on the plan view. But you see the rich decoration, the Romanesque arches on each side of the building surrounding it, and then the great Cathedral of St. Mark's and the somewhat zigzag paving pattern. Very richly decorated, very handsomely detailed for this major public space in Venice. Siena, Italy, had three major public medieval squares. There was the Cathedral Square, the Piazza del Duomo, which basically served as the parvis for the major church of the time. The Piazza del Mercato, which was the field or encampment square, more agriculturally based. And then the Piazza del Campo, which is the one we'll discuss here briefly in the next slide, which was really the market square and really stands out as an atypical layout of a medieval square. Very interesting characteristics for a piazza space compared to other piazza spaces that we've encountered during the time. So the Piazza del Campo was the market square, and it was surrounded by the palace during the medieval era. One of its major other features is the tower which accompanies it. If you look on the next image on this slide, you can see a great image of the shadow of the tower. And basically, the tower acts as a sundial broadcasting the time of day to the observers, which is really interesting. Another interesting characteristic about Del Campo is that it's actually not flat. It's a really bowl-like enclosure of a space. It's not really rectangular. The fact is, it's on a really gentle slope so that all of the drainage actually collects in the kind of bottom center area. Very refined paving patterns during the time. There are 9 major triangular paving pattern pieces. Now, also on the edge, you see there's separation of this kind of external gray area separated from the internal paved area. And this was an area where horses and non-pedestrian traffic would actually utilize this space to move through the piazza. And they would also kind of run horses around the edge as well, so it could serve as a track as well. Contemporarily, they have bollards placed around to separate the two. There are 9 different connections streetwise to the rest of the city, and that's symbolized in the 9 different triangles built into the internal paving pattern. Many medieval towers were built as watchtowers for defense purposes or bell towers for church purposes. In some cases, such as San Gimignano, Italy, they were built as urban landmarks. This city is in the Tuscan hills, and basically, whereas most medieval towers were built into walls or built as aesthetic pieces to accompany piazzas, the towers in San Gimignano are actually built for landmark or guidepost purposes. And towers aren't aligned within the outer walls. In the city, there's this clustering of towers which are supposed to act as a guidepost to traveling merchants on the top of the hills in Tuscany. And feudal lords constructed these towers to show their power and might. So all the different manors within the city, each lord basically constructed their own tower as a means to say, hey, look at how strong our city is. And it's really a symbolic marking of the landscape and an egotistical pursuit of prestige, which was built into the image of the city. And if you look on the first image on this slide, you see a great capturing of these guidepost towers and how they stand out against the urban skyline of the city. So while San Gimignano actually had piazzas, the towers were what were more important. If you look on the next image on this slide, you can see the location of 2 of its major piazzas, but also the dark areas are where the towers are. So in San Gimignano, the street's very messy and confusing and not very ordered. It's very almost like a labyrinth network, and these towers act as guideposts within that labyrinth of chaos. A very dense layout of the cities, very, very narrow streets. So these narrow streets are very indirect on this hilly terrain. And so actually these towers became landmarks for people trying to navigate their way through the city. So you could see them from afar, so you knew that was the city. But when you got in it, you could use these towers as a way of actually navigating your way through the internal city because it was kind of a messy layout. They're very welcome openings in an otherwise disorienting and restricting passage network. Now, there were the 2 major plazas, the Piazza del Cisterno, which was the plaza of the cistern with its major fountain, and the Piazza del Popolo, which is the plaza of the people. But the main feature for Gimignano was more of the towers than the open public space. In this section, we'll discuss some of the early medieval gardens, functionality and spatial components of the gardens, the style of cloister gardens, and the plants and other small-scale elements utilized within them, and how they added to the overall layout of the garden itself. function of most early medieval gardens was primarily just utilitarian in the sense that they were laid out in an effort for horticultural or agricultural purposes. Now, most of the gardens had actually disappeared with the collapse of the Roman Empire, but in early medieval times they brought back at least the agricultural side of garden making. Most of the early medieval gardens were generally used for growing food or different medicinal herbs or other uses similar to these. So they were very utilitarian. Only the really rich persons had a few pleasure gardens at the time. Now, the late medieval gardens, we saw a shift from utilitarianism into more what's known as a locus ammonius. And the locus ammonius means that gardens turned into an earthly paradise and spots from which the wicked were excluded. And they were only open for deserving souls such as princes, poets, lovers, religious personnel such as monks. And this was really a transition into where the Renaissance garden would start to become much, much more formal. Some of the early formal gardens were known as cloister gardens, and they were very similar to the peristyle gardens of classical Roman garden design, where they would have colonnaded areas surrounding this square courtyard area. Typically, there would be a central basin or fountain inside the interior of the courtyard. Now, the difference here is that the colonnaded areas were often twisted or braided or should have some type of mosaics. And this was known as Comatesque styles. So this was a time where, again, what we talked about earlier, the Islamic nation was actually trying to fight for lands as well. So we saw a slight Islamic influence on many of these cloister gardens, specifically in the mosaic and braided colonnade. The vegetation was really scarce and more functionally based as well. So, in other words, it was for mainly agricultural purposes, growing herbs, growing medicinal plants, and less about aesthetics. The space of the gardens was really limited to actually those who worked the grounds. So if you were a serf, you could only interact with a garden if you were maintaining it or creating it, and actually the elite. But there were three different types of gardens. There were herbolariuses, which were purely medicinal gardens. There was a hortus garden, which is purely a vegetable garden. And then there were just cemeteries, which were typically tree gardens where you would have many monks buried. So those are the three types of gardens, very, very utilitarian. And you would see very formal layouts in many cases, but just with an emphasis on a more sparse and more functionally based plant list.
Other than the herbs and vegetables and fruit trees, which were really the most important features of medieval gardens, there were three species that dominated Middle Age garden layout, and they were the iris, the lily, and the rose. So the iris was grown a lot because it was used to create starch for washed clothing. The lily was utilized because there was a lot of snake bites during the time, and it was believed to help cure snake bites. And the rose was generally found in almost all gardens. One, because of its floral beauty, and secondly, because there were innumerable uses for roses. And again, earlier, there was a slight romantic side to the locus ammonius, which really took over in the late Middle Ages. And these became areas for lovers and poets, and they provided inspiration as well as their functional applications. So the piazza or urban square was very influential on garden shape, at least the framework of the gardens, because typically gardens were in square areas as well, and they were typically enclosed. Like many of the urban squares were enclosed by buildings, these garden areas will be enclosed by walls. Walls provided the square framework for many of these gardens. Within these walls, the gardens were typically divided or subdivided into squares or rectangles. So we'll have squares within squares or rectangles within squares. So very geometrically laid out. And this became really the basis for all medieval formal gardens in Europe. And when we get to the Renaissance, they actually take that to the next level and make it much, much more formal and much, much more lavish. So if no walls were present to enclose the garden, they would plant really thick rectilinear hedges or build some type of fence to create the exterior edge if no walls were there. Interiorly, hedges basically served as frameworks for many of the subdivided square garden areas. Now, you could also have planting beds or wooden edging, which define these interior gardens as well, these subdivided gardens. But hedges were normally found in most of early medieval gardens, which added a degree of maintenance to these gardens, which were really, compared to Renaissance and Baroque gardens, much, much more shabby and sparse.
It was in the medieval era that we also saw the initialization of trellises. So A trellis is a framework of light wooden bars which were used chiefly as support for climbing plants or some type of fruiting tree. And these trellises created shaded vine-covered oases in these gardens. So basically we create this really dark tunnel with blooms and highly scented plants. They made basically an interior palace or an outdoor room within basically an open garden area. They also transplanted grasses into many of these gardens. Grassy areas were representative of the countryside. Basically they would cut down grass from meadowed areas in the countryside and transplant them in their interior gardens. And then these were actually the early forms of mowing, really. These grasses were actually beaten down with wooden mallets or stomped to try to keep them short. So there was a second degree of maintenance other than hedging. You would also have to, in a sense, cut grass, although it was basically just a matter of stunting the grass's growth by smashing it down. With this use of grass came the idea of turf seats. So basically they would pile up dirt, create a raised bank, and then cover these banks in grasses that they took from the meadows for seating purposes. And these turf seats became quite popular in many of the formal gardens. It became one of the most widespread design tactics in Europe. So people would sit on these turf seats and have romantic parties or ponder poetically. They became some of the earlier outdoor seating areas, which could also be used as plant edging. It was during this time that grafting of trees became very experimental as well. So they tried to join different fruit trees by braiding them together or placing them in close contact with one another and allowing them to grow with one another. And basically what that did was to create this multicolored look of a singular fruit tree. Although it was a numerous amounts of fruit trees together, on one view it would look like this unreal tree with different colors of fruits upon it. So some of these gardens, they were trying to create fantasy areas where many different fruits appeared to be growing on one tree, although in reality it was a series of multiple tree types just braided together. We also saw the importance of scenic quality come into play. And in many of these gardens you would see what's known as the mount. The mount was a small hill either in the middle of the garden or on some side against a wall within the garden where basically people would stand and view the garden. So this became a vantage point to observe the garden. You would take a guest to your mount and have them stand and view your garden. Typically it was placed at an area where the best view of the garden could be taken in. And since these gardens were normally geometrically laid out, it would obviously be in the center or somewhere on the side near the wall. Sometimes these mounds were round and sometimes they were square depending on who the owner was. We also saw the initialization of the differentiation of space within these functional gardens. Vegetable gardens were typically raised above the ground plane. So if you had a vegetable garden, most of the places where the food was grown were actually raised above the ground plane. They were generally edged with wooden planks, the vegetable gardens. In some cases you would see hedges, but most of the hedges took place in more of the locus ammonius type spaces in the formal gardens. Where moist areas were raised 2 foot high, but drier areas were only raised 1 foot so they could collect more water. So even the raising and lowering of these gardens spatially was done for a functional purpose.